in the year 2010, that program, that model, supported over 1,800 missionaries to the tune of $1.5 million. And so you go, wow, how can a poor state, a poor church in Northeast India provide for so much mission support? But they did.
You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
Hello and welcome back to Our Urban Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed. Today I'm joined by Tim Welch, author of New Founding Models for Global Mission, Learning from the Majority World. Tim Welch served as a missionary in Cote d'Ivoire for 31 years with same UA, including 22 years as national director. Currently, he serves as the same ministry point person for literature. Tim has written 5 books in French and 2 books in English, with a 3rd book, this one for African children, due out later this week. Tim and his wife, Janet, live in Colorado. They have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Our topic today focuses on mission funding, specifically how agencies should adapt multiple models and strategies that can support majority world missionaries. Thank you for joining us today, Tim. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine. Thank you, Dr. Javed, for giving me this privilege to join you. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. It's awesome to have you here. I love missions, and you will see that I will struggle with mission and missions because that's always my thing. I was missions pastor,
Right.
so I always
No problem.
mission or missions. But before we get started, please tell us very briefly about your family. I believe, and I truly believe in this, that the audience connect with the speaker well when they understand this person is a family man. He is human like everybody else. So it should show. It humanizes us as people.
Yes.
So go ahead, please share a little bit about your family.
Sure. Well, I've been married to my wonderful wife, Janet, for going on 42 years now. And our 2 kids, Philip and Katie, are now adults. They have their own children. And Philip was less than 2 years old when we went to Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa. And then our daughter, Katie, was born in Cote d'Ivoire, our first term. So they really see Africa as home in a lot of ways. And they've been very appreciative of the opportunity they had to grow up in another culture and using another language. And, frankly, I think they got the best education possible. So we've always been delighted that our kids got to grow up in Africa.
That's
and
awesome.
We had to come back a few years ago due to family health. Both of our fathers died in 2016, just a few months apart. And that's why we're based now in the United States.
Wow. Yeah, sacrifices, huh? In the mission field. Why does funding matter? How does it relate to Christianity as a religion? Let's start there.
Well, okay. I can think of 3 reasons why funding matters, although there are probably more than that. First of all, funding helps determine who becomes a missionary, and therefore who it is that represents Jesus Christ to the world. So if funding can allow people from all over the world to become missionaries, then it gives the world a much better idea as to who Christians are. When they see missionaries who come from Asia or Latin America or Africa or Europe or wherever, that gives a more representative and a more valid picture of the church to the non-Christian world. So that's one reason why funding matters. And then secondly, funding matters because traditionally missionary finances come through a mission agency or through a church. And that's not going to work anymore for missionaries who are going to restricted countries.
Right.
Missionaries can't leave a paper trail, so to speak, that ties them back to a church or to a mission organization, a Christian organization, if they're working in a restricted country or in a closed country. And frankly, those closed countries are the primary mission field that still needs to be reached for the future.
Right.
And then thirdly, I'd say that the traditional model of raising funds, where missionaries raise their own support, the burden is on the missionary to raise their own support.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's becoming less effective even in the Western world, and a number of authors say that when you do the research. So if it isn't working that well, then let's find some solutions that work better. So there are three reasons why I think funding matters.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you know this. This is to me, that's a fact, because I think your points are so critical for if we really want to engage the majority world into missions field, missionaries from the majority world, then those points are extremely critical. Because even in my own personal experience, I was missionary for 12 years before I decided that I want to pursue a local church ministry. And those 12 years, I never got more than $500. And I lived in New York City, Midtown Manhattan.
Wow. Yes.
And the only reason why I survived, because God provided housing, food, everything, and that $500 was okay. But it was the reason, part of the reason was because Western model didn't work for me. I don't have family. I was immigrant, and I came as a student on scholarship. I don't have the network. And then when I did become a pastor, I was a missions pastor in Midtown Manhattan. Then I would receive similar complaint from my brothers and sisters from non-Caucasian background, that they are struggling to follow that protocol that we put together for them. Like, okay, reach out to this, and then this, and then this. They would say they don't have, because they've been recipient of those gifts and donations and support. And they will tell me beautiful stories where parents will, especially people from ethnically, it was one story was from a brother from a Haitian background. And he was like, so you telling me you want me to give you money? So it was like one of those things, because I think it took a long time for Western, when I say Western missions, I'm talking about especially Caucasian, predominantly Caucasian background folks, to understand what it means to give money toward missions. So I agree with you on those points. And I think these are the things that need to be taught and shared, and pastors. And now, by the grace of God, I serve as a senior pastor of my church. And that's one of those things on my mind, how to help majority world missionaries in that area.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a good description of those points, I think.
Yeah, and there are probably more.
Yeah, I'm sure. What are some of the unique funding challenges faced by majority world missionaries? Please also explain what majority world means for the sake of clarity. You and I can understand. You understand more. I may understand less, but we have some understanding. So, for the sake of our audience, let's make that very clear for them too.
Okay. Yeah, sure. By majority world, I'm using a term that in the past was called the third world, or the 2/3 world, or the developing world. And now it's often called the global South. I prefer majority world just because that seems, global South, there are a lot of countries in the Northern Hemisphere who are part of the global South. So that's what I mean, the non-Western countries of the world.
Yeah.
Now, as far as some of the funding challenges for majority world missionaries, especially those missionaries that are trying to raise support using the traditional model, what you just described, trying to go out and raise your own support. There are a lot of challenges. One is that there's a certain economic prosperity that's essential for the model to work. And in many countries around the world, that economic prosperity just isn't there. And then not only does there need to be prosperity, but it needs to be sustained over a certain period of time if you're going to support a missionary. Like I said, I'm in my 45th year of living that way. So you're talking about long-term sustainability. And so that doesn't occur too often in the majority world countries. And then next, when a missionary has friends that he needs to contact, those friends need to have disposable income on a regular basis. And often they don't have disposable income. And then fourthly, raising financial support for yourself needs to be culturally acceptable. And again, in many countries of the world, I can't go and ask for money for myself. That's not right. And then finally, I think fifthly, fundraising really, it tends to, the way we've been doing it, it tends to rely on individualism. You know, I have to be the instigator and the initiator, and so for these reasons, often none of these premises holds true for majority world countries. And that's why it's such a challenge for people from the majority world countries to raise support. Too many basic assumptions that make that model work aren't valid in their situation.
Can you talk us through the predominant types of funding models? I know that you did mention some of them already, but let's go back. Talk us through the predominant types of funding models and some of their pros and cons.
Okay. Well, we've talked about the traditional model, which is where the missionary raises his or her own support. And in my book, I give 17 other models or strategies. So I don't think we can look at all 18 of them here right now. But there are essentially 4 categories for these models. And those categories are really based on income source. And so the first one, the traditional model, I call it traditional, where you raise your own support. That's where the income source is the individual. It's one person. Now, the pros and cons of that, the pros are that when you get people who support you, often they stay with you long term because they know you. You're not just an unknown name on a church list somewhere. They actually know you and they will stay with you. And the other very important point in that is they pray for you because they know you. And when you're going through a hard time, you don't really care if the money's coming in, but you do care that people are praying for you. So those are the pros. The cons are that the burden for raising your financial support is squarely on your shoulders, and you're not getting much help. And again, speaking for the majority world, the other con is that that's not culturally acceptable. So that's one. Those are the pros and cons of the individual raising their own support. The second one would be some form of employment. And in my book, I talk about tent-making. I talk about business as mission, or BAM. I talk about a spouse and seeking outside employment. The pros are that, sometimes in some of those cases, say, let's say you go over as a missionary doctor, you're employed by a hospital, or you're a teacher employed by a university. Well, you don't have to worry about fundraising. You have a salary. The other advantage of that is you get to go quickly. You don't have to take time to raise support. The need is there, you can go, assuming you're available. So it's a speedy way to get to the mission field. The cons of that, the challenges of that, is that sometimes you can lose your job, or in the case of tent making and also business as mission, a lot of times you focus way too much on your own business because you have to make that business work. And that's not a given. So you have to make it work, and you spend all your time focusing on your business side and not on ministry side. So those are the cons to where the income is based on employment. The third source of income would be the mission agency. And I saw that in both Ethiopia and India, where the mission agency generates the income for the missionaries, not the missionary themselves. So the advantage of that, the pros are that, usually the director of a mission agency is a well-known person. It's an experienced person in terms of speaking in front of others, that type of thing. So that's helpful. A mission director can get an entrance into a local church much faster than, an unknown first-time missionary. The downside of that is that sometimes that mission director can get sick and spend 2 months in the hospital. Well, if he's not out there or she's not out there raising support for 2 months, that's going to trickle down and affect all the missionaries, in subsequent months. So that's the downside of it. Or, maybe you're part of a mission and your mission director is not especially gifted in fundraising. Well, you're going to feel it. So those are the pros and cons of where the mission agency is the primary mover in raising support. And then the fourth one would be where the church is the primary source of income. The advantages of that model is that the burden of fundraising is on a lot of people. And not only on a lot of people in one church, but it can be on a whole denomination. Sometimes not just your local church, but other partner churches join in and help you with fundraising. So that's great. I mean, that really spreads the burden out over a lot of people. The downside of that is that pastors can change, policies can change in a church. And I mean, we knew some friends when the first time we went out to Cote d'Ivoire in 1986, some friends of ours, they went to Ghana with SIM and they got all their support from their home church. Well, that was wonderful until about, 4 or 5 years later, their pastor changed and they didn't like that idea. And all of a sudden, they lost more than half their support in one fell swoop. So that's the downside. So I advocate in my book that we use multiple models. We don't just stick with one model, but let's use multiple models and use them all together so that we can hedge our bets, so to speak. when one of these cons, one of these challenges arises, well, I've got other things to fall back on. And I can just say that, okay, those are the basic categories. I mentioned other models in the book. And, there are ones like, the ones that really stood out to me when I did my research a few years back, there's one called the 12 church model, which came from Peru and Bolivia. And that is where a missionary sought out 12 churches and said, okay, you're going to give me, church number 1, you support me for January. Church number 2, you support me for February. And I thought, that's a great idea. It's simple to understand. And so another advantage of that model is that once a church is given, it can be a poor church. If they can raise the funds for 1 month of support, then they have 12 whole months to raise funds for next January or next February. So they don't have to be a wealthy church to do that. And you can modify that model. And the one example that I know of, they actually used 14 instead of 12. And one church provided funds for travel to get to the field. And another church provided funds for travel to get home on home assignment. So that I thought that was a wonderful model. Now it's got its disadvantages. What if one church doesn't come through? Then you're really stuck. So at least for a month. Wow. So yeah, that every model has its good side and its downside. All right, and then another model I found from Northeast India is called a handful of rice, and that's a model that has been in existence for over 110 years in Northeast India, which is not a wealthy part of India. But that is where people in the church, and started with women, the women in the church for every meal would set aside a handful of rice as they cooked. And then at the end of the week or the end of the month, they would take that rice that had been set aside and give it to the church or to a mission agency. And the funds from selling that rice would go for mission. Well, in the year 2010, that program, that model, supported over 1,800 missionaries to the tune of $1.5 million. And so you go, wow, how can a poor state, a poor church in Northeast India provide for so much mission support? But they did.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's an amazing model, and we can use that. I mean, all over the world, anybody can use that. So one of the pros, one of the advantages of that model is you can use anything. It can be rice, it can be corn, it can be millet, whatever. It can be charcoal. It can be wood, for starting a fire. Whatever it is, you can use it. The downside is that, that it's relied upon the church to be faithful and, you truly using that money for mission. So you hope that your church representatives, are faithful and people of integrity and do it. So I thought that was a wonderful model, already coming from the majority world. Another one, this one came from Papua New Guinea. I called it a mission designation. And that is where people in the church designate something in their daily life or weekly life for mission. So for instance, there was a farmer who had some land, and I don't know what he was growing, but he designated one corner of his lot, for mission. And the person who was telling me the story said that he didn't have much, the farmer didn't have much faith because the part of the lot he designated was actually low-lying and often waterlogged and didn't produce much. And so he was going to give that to the Lord for mission. And the year he did that, that corner part of his lot produced more than anything else. So he learned a good lesson on faith. But and there was another person in Papua New Guinea who was a rancher, and he had cows, and he named one of his cows India. And when that cow was slaughtered, the proceeds for that sale went to mission in India. Well, that's a wonderful model. We can do that with anything. People in the church, let's say you're an Uber driver. You may not even have a full-time job, but you drive for Uber. You can say, okay, my clients, Tuesday afternoon from 3 to 5, that goes for mission. You can just designate a part of your day, if you're a waitress, the tips I get, on Saturday, from 8 to 12 at night, go to mission. You can designate something, and that's a wonderful model. I think let's use it for mission. Another model was called revolving savings, and that's something that exists all around the world. I've seen it in South America and Africa and Asia, wherever. And that's where people in church, often my experience in churches in Africa was that it's usually the women's group. So they would get together, the women's group, let's say you have 20 women, and every woman every week brings and gives $5, let's say that, $5 to the group. And so every week you have raised $100. Well, a woman would have a hard time raising $100, saving to have $100, but she can save $5 in a week. So every week, some woman gets $100. And so over the course of 20 weeks, every woman has received a loan or a savings amount for $100, which they could never save otherwise. And then they can put that to work for whatever they want to do. That type of savings is more effective than savings accounts in banks. And research has shown that even people who work in banks within the bank have set up their own revolving savings. I saw an example of that in Senegal. So let's take advantage of these models that exist already to raise money, and let's apply that to mission. Churches can apply that to mission. You could join in with other churches in your own denomination and do that and say, okay, every week, we'll give $20 for mission. And with other churches, if you had 10 other churches, well, there's $200 a week for mission. And then you can give that. So let's take advantage of these other models that already exist in the majority world and use them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What about the biblical basis for these different models?
Well, in the scriptures, there are a lot of principles for funding, such as the missionary does have the right to raise his or own support and to seek support from others. You see that believers need to be generous in their giving. You see that we can advocate for other people. The Apostle Paul does that. We need to have integrity in how we handle money. So those are biblical principles, for all the models that exist. As far as actual models of giving, in the scriptures, you see tent making in the book of Acts. And you see the idea of people living off the fruit of their ministry. You see that in Philippians, you see Paul talking about in 1 Timothy 5. So those two models exist, tent making and living off the fruit of ministry. But that doesn't mean that these other models aren't valid biblically. Since there are biblical principles that talk about partnerships, which is one of the models I talk about in my book, about employment through hard work, about being frugal and, being wise in how you spend your money, about saving for the future. So, that covers models like an endowment fund. So those other models are biblical in that sense, but you don't see, the Apostle Paul setting up an endowment fund. But nonetheless, I think there's a scriptural basis for all of them.
While your book is helpful and informative to all kinds of churches and denominations and parachurch organizations, how would you advise the average Western pastor to approach funding missions?
Well, my main advice for a pastor is for him or her to see how critical mission is to the message of the Bible. And for the pastor to encourage the local church to initiate mission giving. Last week, I was in Cape Town, South Africa at an African mobilization consultation. And there, a mission leader said that mission is not a department of the church. Mission is what the church is all about. And the advantage of some of these models I've talked about, like revolving savings or handful of rice or mission designation, is that, they're implemented by the local church or the members of the church, not by a mission agency or missionary. And I think the pastor is the key person in instilling a mission vision in the local church. If the local pastor doesn't have a mission vision, he'll have a hard time. The church will have a hard time having that vision. So the pastor is key. So I would advise the pastor to not wait till a mission agency or a missionary comes along asking for support, but to go ahead and see how the message of mission is all throughout the scriptures, and to take a look and see what God is doing around the world, because God is at work all over the world. And, go ahead and do some research and see what God is doing around the world, and encourage the congregation to join in what God is doing.
Yeah. How can Christians in the West best support majority world missionaries?
Well, I guess I would say that one way is to have them support a ministry as opposed to a missionary. And I mentioned that as another model in my book. If God has laid a certain people group on your heart, if he's laid a certain type of ministry on your heart, like radio ministry or Bible translation or whatever, then look for those ministries. You don't have to know somebody, but you can look for those different ministries or missions that are ministering to that people group. Look for those and go ahead and support them. Otherwise, I wouldn't necessarily encourage Western donors to support majority world missionaries. I would encourage them to support Western missionaries. And I'd like to see majority world churches supporting majority world missionaries, because they can do that. But I'm convinced the funding is there. So
wow,
that's what I would say.
Wow, that's bold. I think, especially depending on, based on your previous recommendation, the, economical disparity and lack of teaching in those communities, especially when it comes to unreached people group and people where the gospel has not made bold stand yet, is difficult for those people. But yet, this statement is that still those people should be supporting their work.
Yeah.
Majority
Yes.
world. Wow.
And they can. And I'll give you one example, Ethiopia.
Sure.
Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the world. I saw a list in an economic journal where they list all the 192 countries of the world, and Ethiopia was like the number 161. So, it is really down there economically. But I did research in Addis Ababa, and the Ethiopian church is so mission-minded. They are sending out missionaries. They are concerned about the world, and they're doing these other models. There's a banana farmer who said three of my banana trees are for a mission. They're advocating on behalf of others. There's third-party advocacy. They're using diaspora Ethiopians to help fund. They're doing work projects, digging wells and things like that, and then turning that into a local tent-making business. So Ethiopia remains one of the poorest countries in the world, but they have a heart for mission. And they're doing it. So the economic situation, yes, it's helpful, especially if you're going to be on the traditional model. But you can still support missions in other models and do it. But again, that whole economic question is really tied in more to using the traditional model. When you get outside of that model and use others, there are ways to be very much a mission-minded church.
Are there any commonly held assumptions about funding missions and missionaries that you would like to dispel? Other than what you just said, that's
the first one.
Those, right?
The assumption is that, Africa is too poor, Latin America, Asia is too poor, they can't do it. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. In fact, they are doing it. The Western world isn't the only region in the world with money. So there is the need, though, to help majority world churches see this new economic reality and buy into it. The business world has bought into it. It's time for the church to buy into it as well.
Good. Yeah.
And I think another thing is partnerships between the West and the majority world. A lot of times, they fall apart if the only asset that the Western partner is bringing is money. Partnerships like that usually result in more damage than good. But partnerships can be effective when there is a mutual accountability, when there's a trust relationship already developed, when there's good communication and other things. But it's not just, we have money, you have the people, let's partner. Like, no, you need to know each other a lot better than that. And so I'm not against partnerships, but there are conditions that need to be met for them to work. And then
that's another bold statement you made there again.
Well, sorry, I'm not trying to start any arguments, but that's
good.
And I think finally, it's what I already mentioned, with the church in Ethiopia, and it's also true in countries like Nigeria and India. In the end, mission support doesn't depend on our billfold as much as it depends on our heart.
Mm-hmm.
When we've caught a vision for mission, then people are eager to send out missionaries. And, I think the church in those countries, and especially like Ethiopia, Nigeria, and India, have really caught a heart for mission. And they're doing it.
But let me push back on one thing. I'm going to push back, but the other one is more of a issue that I see, and I think it needs to be addressed from the Western side. So the pushback is, do you see if we say, hey, people in the majority world, even though you economically you are not there, the church is poor. Like, yes, maybe the country is not poor anymore or have more resources, but the church is. For example, let's take the example of India. A large portion of Christians come from Dalit community, right? Same thing in Pakistan. So these are the people who have no education. They are on the bottom of everything. And if we do not provide for them or help them to get somewhere, they will never. because that's where we failed. We did not help them with the education, so they never got to a point. So they're hardly able to. So they will be like sort of like in our contemporary setting in the United States, they are the homeless people, but still they refuse to live in in the street. They're still willing to do whatever it takes, and they get by. So that's one place where I have still that struggle, that if a brother has more, should he not share with another brother who has next to nothing? So that will be the pushback point, right? And of course, you're not saying that don't do it. You're saying that that's one of the things to remember. That's assumption dispelling that, hey, they are capable, because there are some who are doing. So I got that. So the pushback will be how to help folks here in the United States to capture that idea too, right? Not only tell them like, okay, they can do it, so you need to give money to your Western brothers and sisters, but the pushback is against that native missions that we are trying to promote here, right? Because political climate is so bad outside of the United States, especially third world countries or majority world where we want to go, they don't want to receive us. There are more restrictions on visas now than ever before for Americans going there. So that one. And the second thing is more of a struggle that I see in this whole conversation. And that struggle is, if a large portion, and it's true in Pakistan, it's true in Nigeria, it's true in Ethiopia, also everywhere else. There's a large portion of American Western, even Canada is the same way. England would be part of that too, where they have been in the habit of giving money to those who are able to talk back, right? There's those who are able to create reports and create this beautiful thing that the people here can show and make some money. So therefore, they prefer those partnerships, those who are able to communicate, even though maybe they are not the best in the field, local people. So I see that, okay, and I have this a huge issue personally, because my dad, he is one of those guys who can't speak English, but he has one of the largest, more productive church in Lahore, Pakistan, right? But then these kids, they were born, and their parents probably were born in his church. And they came out of this, and now these kids who have no ministry, but they are really good with internet, they're really good with social media, they're really good with creating a narrative and story, even though they don't do much. So this is not one story. I'm just giving you personal story. There are so many stories I receive. And the problem is how to help the West to continue to support, but not just put money in the wrong place where division is taking place in the field now, because they see another person receiving so much money and having those cars and houses and security, where the other brother who's actually doing the work doesn't even have enough money to buy a new pair of shoes that wore out like some 8-9 months ago. So that's
one of the problems with partnerships, and that's been addressed in the past. Robertson McQuilkin from Columbia International University wrote some articles, I think it was in Christianity Today, about the danger of partnerships where you're just providing the money, and how that it creates problems. It creates problems on the field where there are those pastors who are in, and then those who are outside, and it creates competition, and you rely on the donor instead of relying on God. And he gives a whole list of reasons why that is not a good idea. I think it goes back to the whole idea of partnerships, and partnerships need to be very thoroughly researched and studied. And there are a number of wonderful partners in the majority world, and good ones in the Western world. And it's a question of getting them together. But I think the research would show that when the only question is, I'm bringing money to the table and you guys do the work, often the person bringing the money starts to control the scenario, starts to dictate. this is what you have to do. And that's why it requires relationship. It requires trust. It requires communication. Sometimes things change, circumstances change, and you can't use the money the way you thought you were giving it. And that needs to be communicated and understood. And in the end, trust that people are still using it for God's purposes. So there's a book on partnerships by Mary Leiterleitner. I'm sorry. That's an excellent book. And she brings out all of those points on partnerships. So partnerships can work. And yes, Western donors should be generous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They should be generous with partners, but choose your partners wisely, and have their partnerships need to be a two-way street.
Yeah.
Just because you've got the money doesn't mean you get to call all the shots.
Yeah.
And I think too many Western partners come in with that mentality. So
yeah. I love the way you are stating that. Very bottom line you're giving us is be generous, but be wise about the partnership. Vet it carefully, have a reciprocal relationship, and not focus on one side, because he's poor, I got more, or guilt-based, or the other things. I love this idea of be generous, but also be wise in your planning and vetting deeply what kind of partnership, which is true, in any relationship, a relationship between you and I, relationship between me and my wife, you and your wife, it's everywhere. When we get into those relationships, generosity is, it should be there in every way. Otherwise, we will never forgive each other. We will hold grudges. We will destroy a relationship, but also it will deteriorate our household, because who's bringing more in and all the other things. So I think it's good to be generous, but wise how that investment is made. Before we close out today's episode, Tim, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, yes, I would say two things. As I thought about this, some people say, oh, you're presenting all these other models, so you're against the traditional model. No, I'm not against using the traditional model of the missionary raising their own support. I mean, I've been receiving income via that model for going on 45 years now. So, and it works in a lot of cases, and especially in North America. But I think we just need to supplement it with other models and not say, no, this is how you have to do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when I did my research, I ran into a lot of pastors. Now, this was in Cote d'Ivoire and West Africa especially. And they were afraid. They said, listen, if I go to my church and talk about mission, we have to support mission. That's what, is on God's heart. Let's reach the world for Christ. But what's going to happen to funding for local ministry? And what's going to happen to my salary? Are they going to give to that instead of to me? And that's a legitimate fear. But historically, and in my own research, I asked a number of pastors this question. And, does the local ministry suffer when you focus on mission? And the answer is no. Over 80% of the pastors said when they emphasize giving to world mission, local mission funding increased as well. So, the odds are very good. And I've seen that same statement in other sources, that when you focus on generosity for world mission, other giving tends to go up as well. So I think that fear is not founded. And so that would be the other thing, just to, assuage pastors and say, you don't have to fear that, oh, if I do this, my own salary is going to take a hit. Probably not. Probably.
And I think that also true for an average layperson too, a listener, most like the person who will be responding to this podcast is, yes, a pastor, but B, a person who might be thinking about supporting or has not supported and may end up supporting. And for that person, it's important for them to know that it creates a generous heart. When we care about God's business, he cares about us. Not that he's not going to care about us if we don't give, but it's just one of those things that we see that in Nehemiah, right? Or we see that in Malachi. We see that in all these books, when we give, whether it's our gifts and talents in case of Nehemiah's book, or money in the case of Malachi, where they are literally not giving God what God deserves. And he talks about that. So I think
the Lord honors generosity.
So I think it has your comment has the application for everybody who's listening to this podcast. Tim, if listeners wants to get in touch, how can they do that? How should they approach you?
Well, I mean, if they want to contact me via email, my email is just my name and my organization. So it's tim.welch, W-E-L-C-H, @sim.org. And also, I've created a Facebook page. If they want to make comments there, there's a Facebook page called New Funding Models for Global Mission. So just the name of the book. And I will try to make some regular posts to that page and respond to people as they pose questions. I will admit that social media is not one of my spiritual gifts, but I'll do my best.
Great. That will also be included in the episode description. Thank you so much for being here. But let me ask you the last thing I always ask all of my guests, and that is, share with us something funny. Tell us a joke. And here's my rationale for that. Most of the episodes are very tense. We deal with very difficult topics, and sometimes it's important to allow people to, again, go home not depressed but joyful. So tell us a joke to lighten the mood.
Okay, well, here's one that I found that I think you'll like. So there's a cowboy who walks into a bar and he orders 3 mugs of beer. Now he sits in the back of the room and he drinks a sip out of each one in turn. And when he finishes the 3 beers, he comes back to the bar and he orders 3 more. And the bartender comes up and he tells the cowboy, he says, a mug of beer can go flat after I draw it. It would taste a lot better if you bought 1 beer at a time. And the cowboy says, well, listen, you see, I have 2 brothers. One's an airborne ranger, the other's a Navy SEAL, and they're both serving overseas somewhere in very dangerous assignments. So when we all left home, we promised that we'd drink this way in order to remember the days when we drank together. So I'm drinking 1 beer for each of my brothers and 1 for myself. And the bartender said, well, that makes sense. That's a nice custom. And so he dropped it. And every day, I mean, not every day, but regularly, the cowboy would come in and he would order 3 beers and drink them a little bit each one, drink it that way, and drink them in turn. And that went on for a while. But one day he came in and he only ordered 2 beers. And all the regulars took notice. And pretty soon the whole bar was silent. And tears began to come to the eyes of a few of the patrons. And so the cowboy went up, he drank his 2 beers, and he went back up to the bar and ordered 2 the second time. And the bartender said, I don't want to intrude on your grief, but I just wanted to offer my condolences on your loss. And the cowboy was a little bit puzzled, couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And then the light came on and he just laughed. He said, oh no, he said, everybody's just fine. It's just that my wife and I joined the Baptist church and I had to quit drinking. It hasn't affected my brothers though.
Oh man. Oh, bro. That's awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show again. That was Tim Welch. And thank you to all our listeners. We truly could not do this without you. If you learned something, have a topic suggestion, or would like to leave us feedback, drop us a note at oururbanvoices.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcast. Tune in 2 weeks for more honest discussions from diverse voices.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry.